Really sure.
For CP Insider, I'm Stephanie Samuel. I'm here with Peter Rosenburger, and he is going to talk to us a little bit about his book, Hope for the Caregiver. And thank you for having us, Peter.
Well, thank you for letting me be on the show. Or whatever it is you call this. Is this a show? Is this a video cast?
Videocast. Well, my first question, I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about your story because you became a caregiver after your wife was in a tragic car crash. And I wanted to know what were some of the initial obstacles that you had to go through as you began to step into that new role with Gracie?
Well, she had a wreck 30 plus years ago. She was 17 years old, a freshman in college. I didn't know her at the time. I met her a couple of years later. She
Hmm.
had rebounded from that wreck and done pretty well. She had returned back to school. She limped. She had severe trauma, and she was in great shape, and so she kind of bounced back from it. But it was permanently disfiguring, permanently limiting for her and crippling for her. She had not lost her legs. She didn't give those up until many years later, back in the 90s. This was in the early 80s. So when I met her, I just saw this beautiful woman whose beauty captured my eyes. Her courage really grabbed my heart. And then when I heard this girl sing, I mean, it just like grabbed my soul. And I knew that I was going to take care of her for the rest of my life. I just didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what that was going to look like. I mean, who does really? She didn't really know how the future was going to play for her. But you're young, you're in love, and and so I said I do, and I have, and I did. And I think the first obstacle for me was the initial push of what are we going to do about her insurance? Because the moment she said I do, her policy converted to this very limited policy of only $250,000. That sounds like a lot of money, but let me put it in perspective. We left $250,000 $8 million ago. So I had X amount of time to get on a better track for her with health insurance, and this was almost 30 years ago. And so the moment I said I do, it did. And that's what I took off. And I had to learn how to navigate the insurance system. And I was the William Hung of healthcare. Now, you don't know what that means, but for all you American Idol fans out there, when he said I have had no formal training, well, that's me. And I remember there was an employee meeting at the first corporate job I worked at, and they were bringing us in, and they were going to talk about employee benefits. Now, this is what I thought they meant. Hand to God, Cedric. I promise you, this is what I thought they meant. Better lunches and longer park. I mean, better parking and longer lunches. I really thought that's what better benefits meant. I didn't know. I wasn't familiar with this rule at all. And I've come from being that naive to never losing an appeal with an insurance company, dealing with more than 60 doctors in 12 hospitals, seven insurance companies. I've changed policies on her under my watch 6 times, and she's never had a minute's gap in coverage, and she's been considered uninsurable since November 18th, 1983.
Wow.
So that's the reality of our life. That's what we've gone through. So you ask the initial challenges. Well, that's a big one right there. But
Very much
that's not
so.
the challenge. Because as important as dealing with insurance is, and don't let the folks in Washington fool you. They don't really know what they're doing. Look at the mess they've made. They got a $17 trillion deficit. So what? Please don't ask them for advice. But I learned how to deal with insurance companies. That's a skill set that I can teach anyone to do. And once you learn it, you don't unlearn it. It's not something I forgot. Oh, this is what I did with insurance companies. What I struggle with, and I think what the vast majority of caregivers struggle with, and there's 65 million of us that are trying to take care of somebody who has chronic medical crisis, chronic illnesses, chronic disabilities, is the what I like to call the fog, the fear and the obligation and the guilt that comes with living with someone who suffers. Because you get so many different dynamics, and your faith becomes just hammered. Where's God in this situation? Where is the hope that so many people talk about from pulpits? What does it look like to trust Christ while you're watching your wife go into a seizure? What does it look like to believe in God and have faith in God when she gives up her legs?
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, how do you take up a a faith that's been taught to you from the pulpit and use that in a very practical manner as a caregiver?
Well, that is the question, and it's a daily. There's an old hymn that says, "I need thee every hour. I need thee." Well, we caregivers understand that. Sometimes we ought to change that to every minute because it becomes compressed into very, very small time frames. What some people get to work through over a year or 2 years or 3 years or 5 years or a lifetime. And so you have to come to grips with certain things in your faith. What does this look like? What does this mean? And then I came through when I realized that the fog, go back to the fear, obligation, and guilt. That obligation that we have, well, she's my wife. I'm obligated to do this. Well, this is our disabled child that we brought into the world. We're obligated to do this. Or these are my parents. I'm obligated. Well, obligation is a petri dish for resentment. It's only a matter of time before you start resenting and even hating the person that you're caring for if you continue down that path of obligation. But see, as Christians, we come to understand and what everything the scripture tells us that we don't own this. I didn't do this to my wife. She doesn't belong to me. I'm a steward of this. So I replaced obligation with steward and realized she belongs to Christ. I'm doing this as unto Christ. I don't work for her. She's not my master. He is, and I do this unto her. I mean, unto him as I care for her. And I realized that my relationship is with him. I can't look to her to pour back into me at times. Now that's wonderful when she does, particularly in a marriage situation. But a lot of times the caregivers are taking care of somebody who's unresponsive, who has Alzheimer's. Or my brother and his wife, they have a daughter with cerebral palsy that's with severe cognitive impairments. She's 26 years old, but it's like taking care of a 2-year old. She can't relate to them. She can't have that relationship with them that you would have with a normal adult child. So you have to realize that your source of love, your source of of energy for all this has to come from someone other than yourself and from that person.